Okay, welcome back to our series on cognitive on therapy in general. But this week we're going to talk about cognitive behavioral therapy. Sorry, I'm wearing my glasses today, but it's because I have an issue with my right eye, and yeah, so forgive the reflection off of my glasses. All right, so as I said, this week we're going to talk about cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, last week, you may recall, we talked about behavioral therapy straight up. And we talked about behavioral interventions. But one of the things that I said was that cognitive behavioral therapy is usually the more modern adaptation. It's kind of hard to think of therapy as just behavioral. So in this lecture, we're going to talk a little more about accessing the thoughts and emotions that might drive behavior. So they're usually done in conjunction with one another. So as an introduction, when we think back to the 1970s, most behaviorists really didn't want to think, pardon the pun, but didn't want to think about cognition, but somehow or another it crept into their work anyway. So you would have a group of behaviorists who were referred to as radical behaviorists, which is just meaning that all they knew was behavior. All they knew was directly observable events. And then you had your cognitive behavioral therapists. And the cognitive behavioral therapists bring back or integrate behavioral and cognitive therapies. So it was split, but as I mentioned in the previous video, even the body, the national body, the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, ABCT, they changed their name to that for a reason, to acknowledge that cognition was part of their process. Okay. So what is CBT? Well, CBT is, a popular term for cognitive behavioral therapy, but CBT tends to be brief or time sensitive, making it different from psychoanalysis, which tends to be a more lengthy therapeutic intervention. CBT is structured. It's highly organized. You might even go into a session with an agenda. It's present oriented. A lot of the therapies we talked about tend to be present oriented. That's important to focus on the here and now. It involves teaching and learning. Now, we have something called psychoeducation, and psychoeducation is a process of explaining to a client where their thoughts originate from, explain to a client what the symptoms of their condition are, explain to a client what maladaptive thoughts are. So you're basically serving the role as educating and informing them about their condition, but also involves learning. So learning about your client and being open-minded. And in terms of CBT, the primary focus is to modify maladaptive thoughts and maladaptive behaviors. So when we go back in history, actually Wilhelm Wundt, when he did his work on sensation and perception, he used a process called introspection. Now, introspection is a process that relies on cognition. He also had something called apperception, right? Apperception is the more meta analysis of perception, your perception of perception, which requires a cognitive process. So, but when we talk about introspection as a function, that goes all the way back to Greek philosophy, probably earlier, but when we go back into history, it gets sketchier as we go further and further back. But we know with Socrates would use these methods of questioning to get you to think about or better understand whatever you were talking about. Well, how do you know? What evidence do you have? Things like that would be Socratic questioning that we use in CBT. So I think that Socratic reasoning, no matter whether you call yourself a cognitive behavioral therapist or another form, most therapists use Socratic questioning. But what's interesting is that your thoughts can be slippery at times. They can move from thought to thought, or they can be persistent at times. You can have recurring thoughts that just keep popping up, right? So you might explore why a person's thought is shifting from a given issue. We might interpret that as not wanting to face that, or avoidance, or something of that nature. Or if you have intrusive thoughts, as is very common with people who are diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder, we might explore why that thought keeps popping up. Now, in terms to the major players here, we have Albert Ellis, who's known for rational emotive behavioral therapy. We have Aaron Beck and his daughter Judith Beck, who are really the pioneers in cognitive therapy. And we have Donald Meichenbaum, which is all about self-instruction training and focusing on our inner dialogues. And actually, we all talk to ourselves from time to time, but when we say self-instruction, teach yourself to, talk to yourself in a positive way. Okay. So let's talk about Albert Ellis. So Albert Ellis developed his approach in the 1940s and 1950s after he discovered that he himself was not effective at using the traditional psychoanalytic practice. So he had to come up with another approach that could be more useful. And so he used his self-awareness as a source of trying to figure that out. And what he did was he's kind of like, okay, well, this isn't working. So let me try and figure out another way. And he initially started with a term called rational psychotherapy, and eventually comes to the term rational emotive therapy. And then eventually he adds something called rational emotive behavioral therapy, which acknowledges, and I think it's important to start like, well, how did this theory evolve and how did this approach evolve? He first was looking at your thoughts and, whether they were rational or not. And then he's like, you know what? Sometimes it's not just your thoughts that drive behavior. Sometimes emotions could drive behavior. So he had rational emotive therapy, and then obviously the behavioral piece comes in. So rational emotive behavioral therapy is a synthesis between thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Now, Aaron Beck, it's interesting. We talked about Alfred Adler in individual psychology. And Alfred Adler had a lot of physical problems, and he formulated this concept of the inferiority complex. Well, Aaron Beck had similar issues. He had lots of physical problems during childhood, and after missing a bunch of school due to medical issues, he started to believe that he wasn't all that intelligent. So he had what we would call a negative schema or a negative worldview of the self. And so he carried that. But ultimately, he started to challenge them. He started to demonstrate with counter evidence that he actually was smart. He overcomes his physical problems and his negative thoughts, and eventually gets a medical doctor. So Aaron Beck is not a psychologist; he's a psychiatrist from Yale University in the 1950s. Right. So it's interesting, right? So once again, we see a person's individual journey, their experience affecting the theories that they develop, right? So now it should not shock you that Aaron Beck was trained psychoanalytically, right? Because at this point in the history of psychotherapy, most people were psychoanalytically or psychodynamically inclined. That was the prevailing model. And then people shifted away from it as either they formulated their own model of treatment or they were exposed to other models, right? So, as I said, he's psychoanalytically trained, and he was interested in how people develop depression. And Freud suggested that depression is anger turned inward, and that's how it results in depression. Whereas Aaron Beck eventually says, yeah, that doesn't seem right, or that seems incomplete, better yet. And he said, maybe it's, these maladaptive thoughts, these negative thoughts, either about the self or your world around you, or even your future. We're going to talk about the cognitive triad shortly, but these thoughts could be, affecting your view of the self, and that might cause depression. And I'll give you some thoughts that might be linked to depression. I'm worthless. That would be a maladaptive thought. How does it help you to feel that you're worthless? Surely everyone has some level of worth. I'm a loser. Have you lost at everything? I'm a failure. Have you truly failed at every task you've tried? And why does it matter that you succeed all the time, right? So these are all, the thoughts and some kind of questions you might ask a person related to a maladaptive thought. So he comes up with this cognitive therapy. Now, Donald Meichenbaum develops this self-instructional strategies. Meichenbaum actually started, practicing behavioral therapy, but he shifted. He shifted his focus more to your thoughts and how your thoughts can impact you, right? So he shifted over to what we call cognitive therapy, and then to constructivism, right? So ultimately, we can construct our own reality, and that impacts us as people and impacts how we relate to the world. Now, some issues related to self-instruction, right? So self-instruction is all about, talking to yourself and giving yourself guidance, right? So early on, he noticed that people on the streets of New York would sometimes talk to themselves. Now, some of these individuals had mental illness. Some of them were diagnosed with schizophrenia, but he realized that this doesn't always have to be pathological, right? So if you could say, you got this, you actually are smart, you are capable, keep going, don't worry about failure, like these kind of statements, you could actually succeed, you could actually accomplish your goals. So ultimately, he applies self-instruction to a more healthier model, and he demonstrated that in groups these functions can work. So, and self-instruction can be useful for things like managing stress. So those are the key players that we talk about in terms of theoretical principles. I talked to you about classical conditioning. In the previous lesson, we talked about individuals like John Watson, Mary Cover Jones. I talked to you about operant conditioning, and I talked to you about Skinner and behavioral modification and things of that nature. But today, if we're going to talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, we also have to start to embed some other theories that include a cognitive lens as well. So Albert Bandura's social learning theory and the cognitive appraisal theory are the two additional theories that I truly think are relevant to understanding cognitive behavioral therapy. All right, so let's start with Albert Bandura. Now, you may know Albert Bandura from his famous Bobo doll study in aggression, right? So he wanted to see if observing aggression would result in imitating or copying aggressive tendencies, right? And so he designed a study where he showed some children an adult figure being aggressive to an inflatable clown, which he endearingly called Bobo. And other kids, he did not show this aggression. And what he found was that kids who observed aggressive actions from adult models tended to become more aggressive. They copied that aggressive behavior and they emulated or imitated, better yet, that aggressive behavior. And so he said, you know what, this idea of modeling or observational learning or vicarious learning, however you want to say it, it's kind of an important part of how we learn, right? So it's interesting that, this theory says that not only can we learn from our consequences, but we can learn from the consequences of others. And the second acknowledgement or second piece of the cognitive process is not just modeling, but there is a relationship between a person and their environment. So there's a reciprocity between a person and a stimulus. So these two elements are important to social learning theory. One of Bandura's greatest gifts is the concept of self-efficacy, right? Which is the belief that a person can be competent or they can successfully execute a given behavior. Now, it's interesting to separate out the term self-esteem from self-efficacy. Self-esteem tends to be more global, your sense of self, I'm worthless, I'm unlovable, or I'm great, whatever that is. Self-efficacy is usually related to a task. So I'm competent at teaching. I'm really good at basketball. I'm not a good singer yet, but with voice lessons, maybe I could be. These are examples of self-efficacy. Focus specifically on a given behavior, whether you can produce a successful outcome. All right, so, but our self-efficacy, feeling that we can be successful at a task, can impact our choices, right? So, and what we do and how we respond to our environment. So, higher self-efficacy usually results in uh, greater persistence. So, if you don't succeed at first, try again, that kind of thing. Greater effort, you're going to try harder in general, and a greater sense of resiliency, willingness to face obstacles and ultimately overcome them, right? So that's what we see with higher self-efficacy. But in the treatment room, we might have people have lower self-efficacy. So if we were going to try and strengthen a person's self-efficacy, right? We might think about issues like incentives, like how do we get a person to have the motivation to do something, right? Well, incentives is a good way. Knowledge and skills. Well, maybe the lack of success is based on not having the foundational skills. So maybe teaching the foundational skills, right? So the idea of I don't sing well now, but with voice lessons, maybe I could, right? That idea, positive feedback. When a person is trying hard, give them encouragement. Wow, you're really working hard at this. I'm proud of you. I know that this is difficult, but keep going. And then if they master or successfully perform whatever task, that's going to also improve their sense of, wow, I actually could do this. So the goal is to use these factors to strengthen a client's self-efficacy to the point where their default is, I can do this. You know, it's interesting. I have several long-term clients, and one in particular, he always says, you know, Dr. Kaplan, when I first came in, I used to think ... but through therapy, you have taught me ... and now I can ... And I say ... because I'm not really trying to out a client, but it's important because this person in particular came into therapy thinking they were the problem in their relationship. They were thinking that, you know, they were not very good at, you know, romantic relationships. And then there were skills that were taught and then they got better. So that's wonderful how we can use self-efficacy to really foster an inner dialogue in our clients that they can actually do this, they can actually succeed. So cognitive appraisal theories. This is trying to acknowledge that our view of things influences how we relate to them. So if you want a singular sentence that can explain this, people are not disturbed by things, but the view which they take of them. So that's your cognitive appraisal. Your worldview can impact how you relate to things. So if a person, go back to relational work, if you were working with couples, one of the earliest things that I think it's important to tell people is that mindset matters. If you are looking to identify concerns in your romantic partner, I assure you that they are plentiful. No person is perfect. Everybody has their issues, and your mindset matters. So if you want to identify all of the things that they're not doing, that's going to influence your view of that person. If you focus on positive attributes they have, that's going to relate to having a more positive view of that individual. Now, I'm not saying that you should ignore the negative. I think that, we should listen to the messages that come in and see why they're there, how often they come in, and evaluate whether our view of that person or that experience is true. So it's not that you, just only have a positive outlook, ignore the negative. No, negative is important too. But what I am more, emphasizing is that if you love that person and you're trying to build on that relationship, don't let those negative thoughts contaminate the whole person. So maybe the behavior is problematic, but don't generalize it to the whole person, because cognitive appraisal theory is exactly that. Our view of people and experiences are shaped by the way we think about them. All right. So it's interesting from a cognitive point of view, how you process your environmental stimuli shapes your response. So in classic behavioral therapy or behavioral models, better yet, there was a stimulus, and that stimulus was directly related to a response you did. And I mentioned something called SR learning, stimulus response pairing, stimulus response learning. What we're saying here is that you might have a stimulus, and how you think about that stimulus influences your response. So there is an intervening variable being you as an organism, you as a person, and how you process that. So it's not, the stimulus and a response are not directly connected. Your perception, your experience of that stimulus could shape things. And I'll give you an example. Let's say you are a boxer, and the environmental context is that you're in a boxing ring and you're doing your match and you get punched. You are less likely to perceive pain in the moment in general than if you're walking down the street and someone just randomly punches you. Now, what's going on there? Well, in the boxing ring, you anticipate getting punched. So you're going to have the context of the environment is I'm supposed to get punched, right? That's what boxing is. You anticipate it. So you release adrenaline, endorphins, and that helps you cope with the pain surrounding getting punched. Whereas if there are no anticipatory cues, the environment is such that you don't anticipate getting punched, you might interpret that event differently. So you as an organism and your anticipatory cues can actually prepare you for a response. So the reported pain or the behavioral response might be different if you're in a boxing ring versus another context. All right. So when we talk about cognitive appraisal theories, again, it's SOR learning, stimulus organism response. And for a cognitive theorist, the focus is on you, the organism, the perceiving organism, and your interpretation of reality, right? So we focus on your thoughts, your interpretations, right? So that's generally how it goes, right? So it's interesting that we talk about fear as being strongly conditioned. And in fact, even the Little Albert study was all about conditioning and ultimately attempting to decondition fear. But these fear responses can also be cognitively mediated, right? So if you pay too much attention to negative incidents or cues, that could result in anxiety, right? If you overestimate the likelihood of a negative event occurring, that could result in anxiety, right? So there's something called catastrophizing, always expecting the worst to happen. I guess there was Henny Penny in my day where the sky is falling, and the sky is always falling. So if you're always looking for the worst case scenario to happen, you're going to be anxious about the sky falling, right? So, and most of the time, our worst fears don't even materialize. But because of this principle of signal detection theory, we were rewarded for detecting a threat. And if that threat actually was experienced, we say, see, good job, my internal alarm bell system. But if our alarm bell goes off and that threat we were worried about never happens, we ignore it. So it's a system that rewards detecting the threat and validating it. So it's interesting how that system could affect us and make us anxious. So we're always worried because of that. Or if we exaggerate the meaning or significance of a negative event, well, that could result in anxiety right there. So what am I trying to get at is that even fear and anxiety could have a cognitive piece. So this comes from the work of Davey. All right. Now, there are three basic tenets of REBT. So there's unconditional self-acceptance, right? So I basically love myself for who I am with unconditional, with no strings attached. Let's say it that way. And you may remember in an earlier lesson when we talked about person-centered therapy, right? We talked about unconditional positive regard, right? And unconditional positive regard tended to focus on this radical acceptance of another person. But really, this Ellis suggests is we should have that radical acceptance of who we are. So here's one version of unconditional self-acceptance where he says, I do not have intrinsic worth or worthlessness, but merely aliveness. So notice how in this model, it's like, it's challenging the negative thought of I'm worthless. It's don't put subjective value on an experience. Doesn't matter. Just accept you for who you are, and the fact that you're alive is good. That's good. And the subjective values of worth or worthlessness actually can be a trap that results in things like depression. So unconditional other acceptance, right? So when we talk about that, that's virtually identical to the Rogerian model that we talked about earlier in this lecture series. So we have to accept others for who they are without any preconditions. I think I used the language, I love you for who you are, as you are, with no strings attached. And it's okay to acknowledge that all humans are flawed. All humans are unique. We're all complex. We all make mistakes, and that's okay. And we still do not devalue you as a person. We still embrace you, the person. So you got to love yourself or accept yourself without any kind of subjective value or condition. You got to love other people and accept other people without any precondition. And then we got unconditional life acceptance, which is accepting your life as an ongoing existence, regardless of your outcome. Look, in many things in life, you're going to succeed, but other times you're not going to get what you want. Your goal, maybe you're not successful at achieving your goal, but to acknowledge that failure is part of life. When I think of really great people, failure is part of their journey. So Abraham Lincoln lost more election campaigns than he won. Yet he became on the Mount Rushmore of presidents. Michael Jordan, he talks about missing thousands of shots, right? Including game winners, and how, success requires that, right? So ultimately, I guess what I would say is failure is not actually failure. It's merely practice for success. That's the best way to do this. So accept your life experience as it is, regardless of whether you got the outcome you want. So in REBT model, so he talks about this stimulus organism response theory, and he has his ABCDEF model. So he says, here's the sequence. You have an activating event. Something happens in your environment. You develop a belief about that activating event. Then you have an emotion or behavior linked to that belief. Now, you could stop there, right? But he doesn't. You'll have a disputation of that irrational belief, right? Which is challenging the belief in B. You have an effect of that disputation, and then you have a feeling, right? So it's interesting that this process continues with a challenging of one's thoughts and a modification of one's feelings. So through REBT, if you follow this ABCDEF model, a rational belief, it replaces a previously irrational belief, right? And then ultimately we acknowledge that the outcome in F is a more comfortable new feeling. So long story short, what you do in B and C is challenged by D, right? So D is critical in the cognitive reframing process, or the cognitive remediation process, however you want to say it. So long story short, in this model, we don't just allow our thoughts and emotions to run amok. We challenge them. We see if it makes a difference. And then ultimately, it usually does. And then we get a more positive outcome. Now, so Aaron Beck's cognitive theory is pretty similar, right? So You might say, well, what are the differences between the two, right? So let's start with similarities. They both acknowledge that cognition is, our thoughts are at the core of our suffering. And our job as clinicians is to do cognitive modification, right? Which is to adjust or help the client adjust distressing thoughts or maladaptive thoughts. And but they do have these differences in language. So, for example, Albert Ellis uses the term irrational thoughts, whereas Aaron Beck uses maladaptive thoughts or faulty thinking. It's interesting. I default to Aaron Beck. I oftentimes use the term maladaptive thoughts. For whatever reason, and Aaron Beck did not worry about this as much, but I feel like using the term irrational thoughts can create some negative emotion around the thought. So it's more jarring. So I use maladaptive. It's not helpful. These thoughts are not helping you. They're actually hindering you. So that's one distinction between the two. I would say another distinction is that Albert Ellis put more acknowledgement or emphasis on the emotions, right? That's why it's REBT, right? So he acknowledged emotions were part of the process more than Aaron Beck. And it's true that, Beck would say, well, thoughts can result in negative emotions and negative behaviors, but Albert Ellis would say that negative emotions in of themselves can result in negative behavior. Okay, so through the prism of Aaron Beck, he acknowledges that psychopathology is just an exaggeration of normal cognitive biases, right? So we all have cognitive biases and cognitive distortions. We all have that, right? So our self-schema, how we view ourselves and our worldview, can include negative or inaccurate beliefs. And this is interesting because this is similar to Adler's style of life. And then when these negative beliefs are activated or triggered by some life event, that draws either a negative or positive bias or memory, right? So, and it becomes the default. So you have this view of the self, you have this negative event in life, which triggers old memories, oftentimes negative, and that results in you having some kind of negative outcome. So the goal would be to engage in modification of these maladaptive thoughts through cognitive therapy, right? So now I would say that I do use the word challenging these maladaptive thoughts, but Beck's model is more collaborative rather than confrontational. So when we say challenging these thoughts, it's not as a confrontation. I actually use a phrase, okay, now let's put our thoughts on trial. What would the prosecutor say? What would the defense attorney say? So it's, even though I'm challenging the thoughts, it's in a gentle collaborative way, right? I actually use cognitive behavioral therapy as my dominant modality. So now let's get to Donald Meichenbaum and self-instructional theory, right? So he focuses on your response to some kind of stressful event. And this is addressed in a sequence of inner speech. So we can focus on preparation, coping, or aftermath. When we talk about preparation, here's like, okay, I know I'm going to be at a family function that I don't want to be at, right? But I can do this. That would be a thought in preparation. Let's say you had a family that was challenging and you were stuck going there for Thanksgiving. Coping. So this is inner speech during a stressful situation. So now you're at the Thanksgiving dinner, and of course, if one of your relatives says something that's hurtful, which is one of the reasons why you said you didn't want to be there, let's say, hypothetically. Okay, that's Aunt Judy. She's just being Aunt Judy. This is more of a reflection of who she is, not a reflection of who I am, right? These kind of, self-talk that you could do helps you during the process. Or this dinner will be over in a couple hours. I only have to tolerate Aunt Judy for 2 more hours, right? So that helps you cope. And then aftermath, right? So this is your inner speech that occurs after an event, right? So, wow, that dinner was challenging, but you made it. You did a good job. I'm proud of you. Now, so these are kind of like these self-instructional or inner speech dialogues you can have in advance, during, and after a stressful event. And guess what? If you provide these narratives that I'm mentioning, and in a positive way, you can handle really difficult things. And you can handle it more smoothly, you can handle it more competently, and you'll be able to engage the world in a healthier way. So it's interesting, right? So Meichenbaum, he adds to the mix, this self-talk. And self-talk is good, assuming that your self-talk is encouraging, right? So being overly negative is going to result in a more uncomfortable experience. So let's go back to that Thanksgiving dinner is like, oh, I gotta go to this dinner, right? Well, that's a negative. So already you're going to go into the dinner looking for some kind of issue to occur, or anticipating, I should say, not looking, right? During the dinner, if Aunt Judy's saying some hurtful comment, you're more likely to say, see, she always does that, right? So if you do that, that's more negative. Once again, that's going to affect how you relate. And then afterwards, that's why you shouldn't have went to that dinner. That's why, family Thanksgiving dinner sucked, right? Well, that's a more negative inner speech, and that's going to result in more distress. Okay. So from Ellis, in terms of Ellis's point of view and theories of psychopathology, right? So he believed that it was based on irrational beliefs or absolute thinking, right? So person might say, I must do well, or I must be approved by others. What if you're not, right? That's the kind of question that we might ask. Okay, so you're not embraced by others. Do you not have worth, right? Things like that. And he had, Ellis had these terms that were really funny. When people would use the word must, he would say, stop masturbating, which was a way of highlighting that this was absolute thinking, right? It's not helpful to you. Or, I should have stood up to Aunt Judy, right? Well, that's dogmatic thinking. It's fixed thinking, and it's like, all right, well, stop shoulding on yourself, which is a play on word on shitting on yourself, right? Stop shoulding on yourself. So he had these ways of speaking that would really, really catch your attention about if you're using absolute thinking or dogma or whatnot. Now, Aaron Beck, he said, well, psychopathology comes from faulty thinking, faulty assumptions, right? And, I mentioned the cognitive triad, but the cognitive triad is a negative view of the self, the world, and your future. So if you have these three parts, you're more likely to develop depression. So here are some phrases that are related to the self, the world, and the future. I am unworthy, or I suck. The world is falling apart, or the world sucks. And nothing will ever get better. Everything will always suck. So these things, again, that's a cognitive triad. And Meichenbaum would help you identify, or I shouldn't say that because we're in a theory part. He would say, if you have this negative self-talk, this negative inner speech, that is a source of psychopathology. All right. So how do we do CBT? So you might say, well, it's easy as 1, 2, 3. That's a play on words from Michael Jackson, ABC. It's easy as 1, 2, 3. Anyway, but step 1 would be to access the irrational thought, right? I draw it to the forefront, give guidance or instruct a person to help them develop a more rational thought. This might involve psychoeducation or teaching them, and then support your clients along the way, right? But what I will tell you is CBT is not as easy as 1, 2, 3. What do I mean? If a person is going to successfully apply cognitive behavioral therapy, they really should get some training. The Beck Institute in Philadelphia is a great place to get training. The Ellis Institute in Manhattan is a great place to get training. And it's, this lecture in many ways is an oversimplification of the process, but that's what a survey lecture on a model is, right? So it's teaching you the principles and all of that, but we acknowledge that there's more to the story. All right, so cognitive therapy requires extensive training, extensive supervision, and in doing so, you get better outcomes. You achieve more competence in this therapeutic model. So when we talk about assessment, what are the goals of CBT assessment? Well, the goals are to try and, arrive at some kind of diagnosis that explains the client's symptoms. Now, I am not a fan of diagnoses in general. I think that diagnoses are useful for billing purposes or to provide a framework for intervention with the client, right? But what I think is that if you overuse the label, you can pathologize the person. So, in many cases, when my clients come to me, they rarely ask, well, what's my diagnosis, right? So it's not as important. So I believe that the symptoms that the person is experiencing is more important to me than the label we put on that experience, right? So for example, and this is just me being playful, my cat's next to me. So if I change the name of my cat, does my love for my cat change? No, right? My cat is my cat regardless of what I call him. So same thing when it comes to diagnoses. your symptoms are your symptoms regardless of what we call it. Now we need it. We're in a world where insurance companies require you to have a tentative diagnosis, and then eventually that becomes part of the billing record. But I say tentative because you should always be open to changing it if more information comes in. But anyway, so the first part of assessment is to come up with a diagnosis for whatever the client is struggling with. And then the second, goal of assessment is to come up with a treatment plan, right? And a treatment formulation, right? So if we know what you are struggling with, then we can develop an action plan to address it. Right? Sorry, my cat keeps playing with the laptop. When we think of the process, it's assessment, diagnosis, and then treatment. He's going to keep bothering us, so I'm going to hold him a little bit. So assessment, diagnosis, and treatment, that's the sequence, and that's the purpose of assessment. Now, when we talk about assessment issues and procedures, well, we use collaborative interviewing, right? Collaborative interviewing is, I'm getting information from you and I'm inviting you to share information that I may not have covered. Is there anything that you would like to tell me that I did not ask you? And that question, is there anything else you would like to share that I might not have asked you, is so powerful. It teaches the client that they could be the master of therapy, but also that we are not perfect as therapists, and that, it's okay to share things that are not on our agenda. So it's really a useful strategy. Now, so there's collaborative interviewing. We also set the agenda, right? So the idea is like, well, what would you like to work on? Now, what would you like to work on is such a powerful question to ask your clients, because, when you do this clinical interview, you might identify potential problems, but if your client either doesn't want to work on that problem, or it does not have that readiness for change on that problem, you don't push the issue. Now, in terms of the problem list, this is where we identify in concrete terms whatever the client's issues are. So we use the problem list as part of the assessment procedures. We use screening instruments or self-rating scales. An example might be the Beck Depression Inventory or the BDI, right? And then in terms of after the therapeutic process is ongoing, we might use cognitive self-monitoring, right? Something like this week, I'm going to give you homework. And, it's interesting, if a person's never been in therapy and you use that your homework assignment for this week is ... sometimes your clients will get a chuckle because they think, what am I in school? And you explain to them that, no, this is a process of, turning your 45-minute or hour session into a 24/7 process, right? So giving you the opportunity to work on the issue between the sessions, not just in session. So homework is a quite powerful strategy to promote growth. And then, case formulation is really trying to do a sketch of what's going on with the client that usually helps you develop a treatment plan. So I keep mentioning psychoeducation. So psychoeducation is an educational process or teaching the client about their diagnosis, about what therapy looks like, about what their prognosis looks like, and what the interventions are, right? So what you're going to be doing. So for example, I mentioned in another video about I've used empty chair. So if I use empty chair, I oftentimes explain to my client what empty chair is, what the goal on the onset of using empty chair might be, and then I facilitate the process. So it's very, very important to explain what you're doing. So, all right. So in terms of intervention strategies, we might use stories or demonstration or life examples to highlight the CBT rationale, right? So we might explain to you, as I said, your symptoms, what's going on. Oh, where are these problems coming from? What are some sources of these problems? So we might use psychoeducation to explain client symptoms and client problems. And then, we can use this in terms of interventions as well. So long story short, we use psychoeducation for the CBT rationale, the problems, and intervention styles. And we don't even think about it. It's interesting. When you do it after a while, it almost becomes automatic because that's your framework that you use. Now, so if we're going to identify automatic thoughts and core beliefs, we need to help the person out a little bit. So an automatic thought is a knee-jerk reaction to an experience. Well, what's your knee-jerk thought? Knee-jerk. What was your thought that immediately came to mind at that moment? Whereas core beliefs are how we layer this experience and create a narrative about the self. So an automatic thought might be, there goes Aunt Judy acting up again, without even thinking it goes. And then the core belief might be, my family sucks, right? So notice how the knee-jerk thought is on a surface level direct in response to an experience, whereas the core beliefs are on a deeper level and they tend to explain more of what's going on here. All right. So the good news is we have ways of helping people get there. So we have strategies like guessing the thought. So, using the therapist's knowledge and experience to make an educated guess at the underlying thought, right? So it's interesting. We might say, I'm guessing you were thinking or feeling angry when you did behavior X or when you acted out in aggression, right? So that might be guessing the thought. Now, it's interesting because sometimes people will say, no, that's not right. That wasn't what I was thinking. Okay, can you give me, well, what were you thinking? Can you give me more clarity? So that is interesting, right? So when we guess the thought, we sometimes get it wrong, and we're not tied to our interpretation or our anticipation, right? A vertical descent or a downward arrow is underlying core beliefs, right? So going from the surface to the essence, the deeper level. So we might ask questions like, well, what would it mean to you if you did have cancer? Right? So now we're trying to get the subjective value of the experience there. And then, trying to really identify and chase down cognitive distortions, right? So if a person's engaging in black and white thinking, right? Labeling, mind reading, personalization, magnification, minimization, catastrophizing. These are all cognitive distortions. And we might say, well, what do you get by doing this process? What do you lose by doing this process, right? So most of the time, the cognitive distortion is more damaging than beneficial. In the moment, similar to defense mechanisms, it might feel beneficial. It might help you cope with stress, but in the long term, these cognitive distortions are taking a toll on you, and it's affecting how you relate to the world. So identifying these cognitive distortions. Forceful disputing. Albert Ellis was quite confrontational in his approach, and he was doing it by design. Some people found him to be very, very strong-minded or strong-willed, very compassionate guy, but in therapy was very aggressive at disputing thoughts, right? So he applied this to the clients. So he said, as a client, you have to do, if you have these intrusive thoughts or these maladaptive thoughts, or dare I say, he would say irrational beliefs, then you have to mount a counterattack, a rational counterattack to dispute that. Just recently, I had one of my clients who he's on his third marriage, and his first marriage was because it didn't work out because he was young and it was not a good fit. But he did things that, really contributed to the breakdown of the marriage. The second marriage broke down due to infidelity. His wife cheated on him. And now he's in his third marriage of 15 years. So he's been doing pretty good. But one of the narratives that came into therapy was that his current wife devalues him when they're in a fight and says, well, you had 2 failed marriages. What do you know? Right? You're not good at this, right? So it's kind of like, wow, that's a very hurtful thing for him to hear. And so I engaged in this vigorous and forceful disputing with him. And I said, well, hold on, let's stop. Why did you get divorced from your second marriage again? And I knew the answer. It was more trying to get him to articulate that, right? So I'm leading him into disputing these thoughts. And he said, well, my ex-wife, she cheated on me. And I said, and if she would have wanted to work on the relationship, would you still be married? He said, maybe. I probably would have stayed with her if she was apologetic or whatnot. I said, okay. And he said it would have taken him time to get over the infidelity, but he would have. I said, so, what did you do to contribute to the breakdown of your second marriage? And he listed things. I said, okay, fine. And in relational issues, it's if we were to put a percentage on it, what percent of the breakdown of the relationship was on you? And then in this case, it was in the minority. It was, about 30%. And 70% was his ex-wife. And I said, well, why is that a fair statement for it to be, well, you failed twice at this, and you're not good at this. If there wasn't infidelity, or if there was a willingness to work after the infidelity, you would have probably still been married. So this is guiding a counterattack, because he said it nonchalant and he was just talking as if it was fact. And I needed to go in there and challenge that a little bit. Okay, now we have shame attacking exercises, which is basically getting people to get outside of their comfort zone, getting people to do things that evoke whatever the negative feeling is, but also trying to desensitize oneself to it. So a shame attacking exercise might help a person learn to accept themselves, such as getting them to sing in public or shout in public and not worry about what other people are thinking about them. These are kind of ways to go about it. Graduated thinking. This is a counterattack against black and white thinking, all or none, right? So instead of looking at the ends of the scale, let's think in shades of gray, right? Getting people to fill in the middle of the scale. You might say, well, are there any other interpretations that you might come up with that are somewhere in between here and here? So you're getting them to view thoughts in a concrete, measurable, scale-like way. And then stress inoculation training is getting people to expose themselves to a stressful situation while adding some kind of positive or helpful self-statement. Now, I actually, before I go on to the next slide, what I want to do is share with you this week's video as an application, and then we'll finish up the slideshow. So let me pull that up a second, and we'll go from there. So again, this is not my video. This is Summers Flanagan's video. They do a really good job in their training. So here we are. So I'll pull it up, share a screen. Okay, good. So I'm going to play it, and I'm going to close my screen out so that I'm not a distraction.
This session is an example of cognitive behavioral therapy with John, who is actually also one of my favorite therapists, working with a client named Meredith.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
CBT, as it's popularly called in the literature, is similar to behavior therapy in that it focuses on learning theories, with the real specific focus in the session being what are the maladaptive or irrational cognitions, and what are the maladaptive or unhelpful behaviors that the client is engaging in.
Right. And when you work within the realm of cognitive or cognitive behavioral, it can be very gentle, very collaborative process, sort of like Aaron Beck.
And I like that approach,
right.
But also it could be a little more abrasive and forceful, like Albert Ellis's rational emotive behavior therapy and his tendency to dispute or to use disputation to push people out of their irrational thinking.
So in this session that we're about to watch, John uses a very standard cognitive behavioral opening, and he makes a problem list.
And in this particular segment, we don't see Meredith list any more problems than the first one, because that's the one we chose to work on.
He also uses the classic 3-column cognitive behavioral technique, working with the problem of shyness that she's experiencing.
And so let's take a look.
Okay.
Well, Meredith, we know each other, and but the way we usually start a CBT session is to set an agenda.
Okay.
And so we might have several ideas about what we want on the agenda, but the first thing is usually for us to make a problem list
Okay.
together about whatever it is that you might want to work on.
Okay.
And then we'll do the problem list, and then we'll explore the thoughts and the behaviors that might be related to the problem. And hopefully by the end of our time together, we'll have a clearer idea about what's causing the problem and some ideas about how to maybe change things.
Sounds good.
All right.
So, one thing that I've been noticing lately is that I have a tendency to kind of hang back in groups.
Mm-hmm.
And I tend to observe instead of participate.
Okay.
And a lot of times I get really nervous when I feel like I'm expected to speak up. And I want to speak up, but I kind of feel like I freeze.
Okay. And so in particular, then in groups, the setting is big groups, little groups, does it matter?
It doesn't matter a whole lot, but generally I guess medium size, like, in classes that I have. So they're usually like maybe 12 people or so. So relatively small, medium. I don't know what size that is.
Okay. And so, but in your head, you probably would say, I would like to speak up. But for some reason you feel inside some anxiety or nervousness about that.
Definitely.
Okay.
And then sometimes when I try to force myself to speak up, when I actually don't feel ready, I get like, I feel like my throat's closing and I get a red face.
Okay. All right. So that's sort of one possible issue for us to talk about. Could you maybe give me a specific example of a particular group situation, very as recent as you can, where you had this feeling of hanging back and maybe some fear of evaluation?
So in my statistics class, each week we have it's called an inclusion activity. And generally, I guess it's supposed to help people feel like the group's more cohesive and included.
Okay.
But I usually experience it as the opposite. So there's usually a task at the beginning of each class of like, take off your shoe and talk about the most interesting place your shoe has been. Stuff like this.
In stats.
Yeah. That usually I get really nervous and I feel like I can't think of anything to say, and I feel like I usually end up saying something really awkward or lame, and I just don't feel good about it. Like I feel.
Yeah. Can you give me that specific example of the recent time when maybe, and what you said too, including sort of the beginning, what happened, and then how it ended?
Yeah, so when we did this activity, it's like a really weird example.
Yeah.
When we did this activity, probably 6 or 7 people had gone in front of me, and I was like not listening to anything that anyone else was saying, just totally self-absorbed in terms of like, oh God, what am I going to say? And not being able to think of anything. And then when it was my turn, I was wearing a pair of shoes that like are kind of like they have lace on them. And so I took it off and I said, I like these shoes because I get cool tan lines from them. So I didn't even really answer the question. That was like, where have these shoes been? Or like the coolest place these shoes have been or something like that. And then after I went, I didn't really listen to anything else anyone said because I was still like stuck on why didn't I answer the question and just kind of feeling awkward.
Okay. So what I'm doing here is I've got several columns that I'm building. And the first one is you're in the stats class and you're going through an inclusion activity. And the second one is the thoughts that you're having. Okay. What thoughts are going through your mind? And the thoughts are, oh God, what am I going to say?
Mhm.
Those are the early thoughts. And then maybe the later thoughts are, why didn't I even answer the question?
Yeah, and like, why can't I ever be articulate?
Okay. Why can't I ever be articulate? Okay. And then our third column are the emotions that you might be feeling. And so as you're in that situation and people are taking their turn, the teacher says you're doing the inclusion activity.
Mhm.
People are taking their turns, and what are you feeling? How would you describe your emotional state?
Nervous.
Mhm.
Yeah, like fearful.
Okay.
And like it's almost like I'm anticipating embarrassment.
Mhm.
I don't know if that's a feeling or not, but usually I feel embarrassed.
I put that in the thought
Okay.
column just because it seems like the anticipation of it is probably a thought, but embarrassment when you're in the middle of it is probably a feeling.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Mhm.
And then, so I got nervous, fearful, embarrassed as the emotions. And on a scale of 0, not at all, 100 being the most of that feeling you could ever have, how would you rate? Let's get rid of nervous because it's sort of covered by fearful. How would you rate fearful and how would you rate embarrassed?
Maybe fearful, like a 4.
Okay.
Or a 5. I don't know.
4 out of 5 out of 100.
45.
Okay. Feeling pretty calm. So a 40 or a 50.
Yeah.
Okay. Embarrassed.
I'd say that's higher.
A little higher.
Yeah, like a 70.
So maybe a 70. And that would be at the moment that you're talking, or right afterwards, or right before. Fluctuate at all?
Yeah, I'd say like both during and after.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Mhm.
Okay, so during and after. All right. And so, the cognitive approach to thinking about what's going on is that it's not the situation that causes the emotional reaction, but it's what you're thinking that causes the emotional reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems to me like one of the things that's going on, oh God, what am I going to say? And why didn't I answer? Why can't I never be articulate?
Why can't I never be articulate? That sounds exactly
perfect. We might have to start rating my anxiety now too. So it's the other thing you said, that you're anticipating embarrassment. And so are those words too also that are going through your head?
Yeah. Like, I wish I could be more clever, or I wish I could have just like a funny story right now.
Yeah.
Or make people laugh in a way that I want them to laugh.
In the preceding segment, obviously, Meredith is a very interesting young woman, and she talks a lot about some what might be considered irrational thoughts or maladaptive thoughts. In particular, we get to see a little glimpse of what she does that is black-white thinking or dichotomous thinking.
Right. And she comes along with the process, even though obviously she's even kind of shy in the session and nervous. Yeah. So in the next section, we can watch as you focus more on that black and white thinking that's getting her in trouble.
Right. And I also take a look at and try to point out helpful versus unhelpful thoughts. And I find that that's a good way to use, that's a good language to use with clients when you're using cognitive therapy, because they naturally kind of get a sense that, yes, some thoughts are less helpful, some thoughts are more helpful. And in the upcoming segment, I actually do that in the here and now. If it happens in the room, I get a chance to point that out to Meredith.
Right. So let's take a look at that.
And one of the things I'm doing now is a lot of times when you think about the thoughts that trigger the emotions, these are the thoughts that we would categorize as less helpful, okay? Kind of unhelpful thoughts. And then over here, what we're doing is we're coming up with some thoughts that might be more helpful, okay? Recognizing that no thoughts are perfect, but some thoughts are more helpful, some thoughts are less helpful. And you know, in your SAS class, you're going to do the inclusion activity
Every week.
And so one possibility is you could come in prepared to shift your thinking from the less helpful to the more helpful. Just an idea.
It's a good idea.
Okay. So what else besides this is silly and what I say doesn't matter all that much?
I can be clever sometimes.
I can be clever sometimes. Good. That's sort of a counter to the why can't I ever be articulate?
Yeah.
Or why can't I never be articulate? Either way you say it. Let's pretend for a second that you were talking to a friend who had exactly this same scenario, and she was telling you the way that she talks to herself. Oh God, what am I going to say? And why can't I answer that? Why can't I ever be articulate? I know I'm going to embarrass myself. And so she's talking to herself that way. How would you talk to her?
I think that I'd probably express surprise because I imagine that usually I don't perceive her as inarticulate or as embarrassing as she sees herself.
Okay, so you would be surprised and kind of reassuring to her and say, oh, you don't seem that way. And if you could be on her shoulder in the situation, what would you whisper in her ear? This is a good friend of yours. You want to be helpful.
I would tell her that she's funny and charming and usually has really cool stories to tell because she's had lots of good experiences.
You'd be sitting on her shoulder saying things like, you are funny and charming and you have cool stories to tell. What's it feel like when you imagine actually even saying those words to yourself in this kind of situation?
I mean, it sounds pretty ideal, but it sounds really far away from my current experience.
It's not what you're whispering in your own ear.
No.
What would stop you from actually doing this, from talking to yourself just like you would talk to a good friend? Because you're talking to yourself, you're kind of talking to yourself more like somebody who wanted to pull you down. And so I just think, what about that good friend? I mean, can you be a good friend to yourself in those moments and say something more supportive? You are pretty successful in a variety of different things in your life, right? And so if you take one of those examples and you kind of break it down, are you able to, what do you do to prepare? Well, for example, even for a statistics test, I would guess that you have to go through some preparation.
Study.
Study.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Kind of like studying. Have you ever been in a play or a dramatic performance of any kind?
Oh no, I avoid that.
Totally. Not even like in grade school?
No. I think I maybe was in 7th grade.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I had a very small part.
Yeah.
I've always, like my whole life, shied away from being the center of attention.
Mm-hmm.
It never feels good to me.
No.
Which is ironic since I'm going to school to become a teacher.
Yeah. So you have taught before and spoken in front of groups.
Mm-hmm.
Small,
Mm-hmm.
medium.
Yeah. But it never feels.
It never feels comfortable.
No. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No. Yeah,
So even right now, as we're talking,
Uh-huh.
okay. So I hear you say, it never feels comfortable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Would you put that thought in the category of helpful or unhelpful? To say that to yourself.
I'd say that's unhelpful.
Unhelpful.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What's unhelpful about that thought?
It kind of makes me feel like no matter how much I prepare, I still won't feel like I'm good enough or competent or.
Yeah. And just before that, you said, I always shied away from attention. It's never felt good. Okay.
Some pretty black and white thinking.
Well, that is pretty. Yeah, good job noticing that.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear you saying that black and white thinking is maybe too general in that it doesn't provide any real hope for it ever changing.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, it does seem like it fits in that unhelpful category.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I definitely think like, if you're nervous about something to a certain extent, that's healthy because it makes you prepare more.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, that kind of thinking of being like, it will never get better, it'll never be okay, probably isn't that helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wonder if that's maybe as we think about the preparation stage, that's one of the things that you said for a stats test you would study. Mm-hmm. I wonder if there's some way you could study this way that you have been thinking about yourself. I'm just not clever in a group. I'm just not comfortable. I've always shied away from that. I wonder if there would be different ways you could say things to yourself.
Mm-hmm. For instance,
there
are times when I am comfortable in groups.
There are times I am comfortable in groups. And that you probably would put into the more helpful thought category. So it seems like you've got this sort of circle of thinking in there that takes you down into a negative place, that the embarrassment kind of starts this negative spiral, takes you downward to, you're probably not consciously thinking, I'll be alone and unhappy. But somehow it's related. People will think you're stupid. They won't want to be around you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I feel like I like not really on purpose, but like I end up doing things to like make myself not seen, like kind of invisible. Mm-hmm. And then usually I don't feel like that's as rewarding when I feel engaged and involved in a group.
It kind of backfires and you probably feel more lonely and unhappy based on withdrawing and being more invisible.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Mm-hmm. And so you hold that belief of, if I do something embarrassing, it will go down that spiral. I'll be alone and unhappy, despite the fact that you told me just a couple minutes ago that you had a very embarrassing experience that now has added to your repertoire as a good storyteller. It's another story you can tell.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So you can see that I'm questioning the evidence, and I wonder if you are questioning it too, or if you're just thinking, I better go along with this for now.
No, I definitely think that you're right. I just like hearing you say that I'm a good storyteller. That's so not my experience. I don't think I'm a good storyteller,
Yeah.
so it's hard for me just to say sure. But I agree with the evidence part.
There is evidence that you have told some good stories.
Yes,
You're not sure you would conclude that therefore makes you a good storyteller.
exactly.
Mm-hmm. So sometimes you are a good storyteller, and sometimes you're a less good storyteller.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I can hear you. So you're very careful about coming to any positive conclusions about yourself, but you're much less cautious. You're much less cautious. You're more of a risk taker when it comes to jumping to negative conclusions about yourself. Would you say that's?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that's accurate.
And so as we kind of head down sort of toward the end of our meeting today, I'm thinking about, well, what might be some useful things for you to try, experiment with, to see if it's helpful for you in coping with this situationally based problem.
Mm-hmm.
Rita, I really like using that third person technique as a method for helping clients talk to themselves more gently. And then I really like the idea of her actually being on her own shoulder and whispering kind and supportive and positive things in her ear instead of the critical things that she often was whispering to herself.
Right. Well, you were very gentle and encouraging, and I think that helped her actually reveal even more extreme black and white thinking that she's subjecting herself to.
Yeah, in the end, this should help her automatically question her automatic thoughts a little bit more than she did in the past. And I have confidence. In fact, she said at the end of the session, she thought that this would be helpful to her in the future.
All right. So, you know, I like a lot of what John did in that session. One of the things he doesn't talk about, but he just does, because I'm sure, as I said, sometimes we tend to just do the task and go on autopilot, is he engaged in this thought record. And he started to say, okay, well, what was the event? What were the thoughts and feelings around the event? He asked her to rate the percentage or severity from 0 to 100. And then he engaged in some level of disputation or challenging of these thoughts. And what wasn't on the video but is done is that you then ask a person, after you say, okay, well, helpful thoughts, less helpful thoughts, right? Is then you say, well, okay, what is a more reasonable interpretation of that statement? And then you go back to the emotions and you ask them to rate the emotions. And what I find incredibly fascinating is that when you do that, people, the fear, anger, criticism, all of these emotions, criticism's a thought, not an emotion, but all of that drops. So the severity changes. I also liked how he kind of brought a third person into the room. Well, what would you say to a friend? And highlighted the double standard where you're so generous and so positive in how you view your friend, But when it comes down to you, you don't apply the same standard. So there was a lot good happening there. It's clear that a lot of these individuals are students from their university, grad students who are, if we're going to talk about diagnoses, diagnosed with a large helping of normal, but they're there for the role play, and he's trying to demonstrate skills. The smug look on Meredith's face tells me that she kind of knew where he was going and leading her, but she played along. And even, I guess, John at one point caught it, and he was like, hey, wait a minute, right? Are you just going along with this, or do you really feel this, right? So a lot of cool stuff happening there. And, he's a master clinician. So obviously that showed in the session. But okay, let's continue. So let's evaluate CBT, right? So in terms of CBT should be described as CBTs, as a plural, cognitive behavioral therapies. They are pretty widely used and fairly respected. They're referred to as an evidence-based practice. There's a lot of support for CBT. It's used for virtually every clinical diagnosis you have. So it has a lot to offer. Now, one of the things that I do want you to think about is, what's the difference between CBT and those long-term insight therapies? One of the questions that is still left is that these studies oftentimes focus on either short-term or immediate gains, or relatively immediate gains, but what's the long-term effects of CBT? And what are the long-term effects of CBT relative to other models? And I would tell you that, even though we say it's evidence-based, a lot of those long-term insight therapies, including psychoanalysis, which some people criticize, have tremendous things to offer, tremendous gains. But many of the efficacy studies are on immediate effects, which is an issue. And, a lot of the outcomes research is done by CBT-oriented researchers. So are we having an allegiance effect where the outcomes match their orientation? Are we having differences in outcome due to the fact that you have master clinicians like John is? These are questions. These are questions that we have to think about. Now, in terms of cultural and diversity considerations, so CBT focuses largely on the symptoms within the individual. And as a function of that, the focus is not specifically on culture and gender, right? So it's what your experience was, what your thoughts are, what your emotions are. Now, it's important to know that you can adapt it for cultural and diversity consideration. So I don't want you to think that CBT can't be used, right? So it's interesting, right? So another consideration we have to worry about is client blaming or victim blaming, whatever you want to call it. We don't want to engage in making the client the problem rather than the symptoms, because it's not uncommon for people to internalize the symptoms they're experiencing or the social forces they're experiencing. And that's an issue. We also have to worry about potential microaggressions, which are these fairly commonplace, everyday, minor slights of the individual. usually that we're not meaning anything by it, but it's our lack of cultural awareness that we kind of step on something. So it's oftentimes unconscious that we slight the person or minimize their culture or their experience. So we have to be very careful about that. So there are cultural adaptations to address microaggressions as well. And then, when we talk about CBT, we have some LGBTQ affirmative CBT, which is designed to work with the LGBT community and help combat one's experience with microaggressions related to the LGBTQ community, or help them develop a positive sense of self in spite of potential external negativity. Now, in terms of spirituality, it's tricky, right? I'm actually a practicing Jewish individual, so I think religion and spirituality are very, very important. But if not for that being part of my worldview, it's possible that one might challenge an individual's spiritual belief in an uncomfortable way, or treading on their culture or their religious beliefs. So CBT practitioners have options. They could ignore religion and spirituality altogether, which I don't recommend, because if it's a central part of the person's identity, that's not good to do. You could freely challenge religious belief whenever they cause you emotional distress. My religion suggests that I have to do X, Y, Z. Have to? What if you didn't, right? That would be challenging it. And then obviously, a third option is to integrate religion and spiritual knowledge into practice to have a more nuanced conversation about religion and spirituality. This is what I do. And I feel comfortable talking about religion and spirituality because it's part of my identity. But there is two things that we talk about when we talk about religion and culture. You have to have cultural competence and you have to have cultural humility. Cultural competence is knowledge based, and humility is kind of, acknowledging the limitations of your knowledge and curiosity about other people. So when I talk about religion and spirituality, I never claim to be an expert on anyone's faith, except for the one that I'm steeped in. So it's important to be humble in this process and say, from a Orthodox Jewish point of view, here's how I would understand this. I know each faith is different, but what does your faith say about this? So you're grounding the conversation in a religion, knowing that they have sorry, my cat again keeps coming into frame, knowing that they have, a religious identity of their own. So it invites them to talk about similarities and differences. Okay, some concluding thoughts. In a relatively short period, as I said, we're talking about 50s, 60s, 70s when Ellis and Beck are breaking through. CBT has garnered a lot of scientific support. It's very empirical. It works for many different issues or concerns, but it's not for everyone. Some people may not like this Socratic nature of questioning and challenging. So it can be heady at times. It can be, we could lose the emotional piece of it at times. So people want to be more in touch with the emotions, might not feel as supported. And then it's also important to acknowledge that there are newer approaches to counseling and psychotherapy that might even be more effective than CBT. So you really want to ask yourself, well, does this technique I'm using result in the symptom going away? If it does, great. So we'll use it. If it doesn't, we have to have some kind of theoretical flexibility to use another model. So that's really all I have for you today. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope you have a great week, and I will see you next time. Take care, everyone.